You've been watching this speech this morning. How significant is it that Russia is pulling out of this arms control treaty?
It's important, but it's not unexpected. Not only does this follow a trend of Russia pulling out of arms control treaties when it feels that it's in an advantageous position to do so, but also, of course, the precursors for this have been in place for some time. The warnings from the United States have been growing that Russia was not in compliance with the treaty. It's interesting the excuse that President Putin has settled on for wanting to review the rationale behind this treaty. He's pointing at the UK and France as countries that ought to be brought into strategic arms control of this kind. But in general, it's just part of an overall pattern of Russia being less and less restrained.
Of the audience at the Kremlin on their feet, giving Putin a standing ovation. Are we likely to think that they believe him? Or is it simply, as my guest Stephen Pound was saying, that they have no choice but to support him?
Well, those are both true, of course. There will be people who believe what President Putin says in this fantasy land that he's created, this complete mirror image of what's actually happening in the real world. If you look at the first 20 minutes of his speech, where it's this familiar recital of all of his grievances against the West and the reasons for the current war in Ukraine, they're the 180-degree opposite of what has actually happened in real life. But of course, within Russia, people don't have the same amount of access to the information about what's really happening. But then, of course, they have to back Putin in this. And the standing ovation will not just be for the threats against the West, not just for the wild language about nuclear weapons, biolabs, Nazis, and so on. It's also for all of the economic measures that he's announced, also for all of the fine detail about how Russia is doing so well at the moment. And its economy is thriving, and it will make people wealthier. There's a big element to this speech that is about very mundane details of how the Russian economy is progressing, as opposed to all of the really quite dramatic language that's used against Ukraine and against the West.
How is the Russian economy doing, Keir? Because I don't think it's doing as badly as people expected it to, is it?
It depends which people you're talking about. Now, some people expected immediate dramatic effects from Western sanctions against Russia following the invasion, the February invasion of Ukraine last year, but they were never designed to have an immediate impact. And of course, some of that was mitigated by Russia's energy revenues. The fact that for some time, countries were still buying Russian oil and gas and propping up the economy and providing sources of revenue that were supposed to be cut off by the sanctions. But most economists agree that the long-term effect is going to be far greater. The problem, of course, is that President Putin in his speech is pointing at the Western sanctions, he says, being intended to make Russian citizens suffer, and of course blaming the West for this as opposed to Russia's own actions. Russia, we know, can withstand a great deal more economic pressure because its economy is resilient, because it can suffer a great deal more of the degradation that we've heard President Putin refer to this morning. But sanctions overall are a long-term tool, not an immediate one.
He said he would respond to any challenges from the West. Do you hear that as an act of escalating the potential aggression?
No, there's a lot of standard language that we've heard from this. In fact, people's buzzword bingo cards were filling up very rapidly in the first few minutes of Putin's speech. All of the usual complaints and all of the usual threats as well. There was a reference to use of nuclear weapons in this speech, but it was a very subtle one, much more subtle than we heard over the course of the last summer, where there was this intense and constant driving home of the nuclear threats from Putin. He was talking about the calls for a defeat of Russia in Ukraine being the same as threatening the existence of Russia itself. And that, of course, is one of the criteria that they use for when they can use nuclear weapons. But it's roundabout language, it's quite well coded, and so it's only people that were paying close attention that will see this as an effort to deter Western backers from providing Ukraine with the kind of support it needs to win the war.
He announced that he's suspending participation in New START, a strategic arms reduction treaty between the US and Russia. Just remind our audience, what does that mean?
In effect, it's what we started talking about at the beginning of this interview. It's Russia stepping away from one of the few remaining arms control treaties, in this case regarding nuclear weapons, that actually kept the development of nuclear weapons on both sides under control. And again, the specific rationale that he has pointed to for doing this is the fact that the UK and France are not included in that. He's also said that Russia may resume nuclear testing. That, too, is an expected development, but he specifically ruled out that happening unless the United States starts first. So that is an interesting twist on things that we were thinking were going to happen anyway.